Settle in now. Let the day go soft around the edges. Let your shoulders drop just a little, and let your breathing find its own slower rhythm. You do not need to be anywhere or do anything for the next little while. This is a story, and stories have a way of carrying us to places we never expected to go. Tonight, we are going to the Nile. Not the wide, busy Nile of postcards and cruise ships, but the Nile of long ago. The Nile of the flood. And we are going to climb aboard a wooden boat, find a quiet corner among the ropes and the cargo, and discover something very particular. How the boatmen of ancient Egypt managed to sleep, night after night, while the whole world around them was underwater. You might think that sleeping on a boat is a very simple thing. You find a flat spot, you lie down, you close your eyes. But the boatmen of the flood season had a very different problem than we do. They did not have to wonder whether the boat would rock too much or whether a wave would splash over the side. They had to wonder whether the ground they had tied their boat to was still there at all. Because in ancient Egypt, when the flood came, the river did not just rise a little. The river became the world. Let us ease into this slowly, the way the Nile itself used to ease into the land. For most of the year, the river is a narrow ribbon of green and blue, cutting through the desert like a patient, persistent thread. On either side, the land is dry, brown, crumpled with heat. The people who lived along the banks knew exactly where the water ended and the land began. Their fields were laid out in long strips, and the irrigation ditches carried the river's gift to the roots of the barley and the emmer wheat. Everything was orderly. Everything had its place. And then, around the middle of June, something changed. The water began to rise, not all at once, not like a wave or a storm. It rose the way a pot of water rises toward a boil, slowly, steadily, day after day after day. The river, which had been content to stay within its banks, began to stretch. It crept over the mud, over the grasses, over the low edges of the fields. The ditches filled and spilled. The land began to disappear. And by the time the flood was at its height, around September, the river had become something else entirely. It was a sea, a shallow, warm, brown sea that stretched for miles on either side of the original channel. The villages, which had always sat safely above the floodplain, became islands. The date palms stood with their feet in the water. The temples, the great stone temples, remained high and dry on their platforms, but everything around them was liquid. And in the middle of all this water, floating gently on the surface, were the boats. Now, you might imagine that the flood season was a time of fear. And for some people, perhaps it was. If you were a farmer, you had spent the spring harvesting, and now your fields were underwater, not to be planted again until the water retreated. If you were a builder, you had to plan your work around the seasons of the river. But for the boatmen, the flood was a time of work, and a time of strange, floating freedom. Because when the water covered the land became navigable. The flood turned every village into a port. Every doorstep, every courtyard, every little hummock of dry ground became a potential landing place. And the boatmen, who knew the river the way other people know the rooms of their own homes, took full advantage of it. let us picture one of these boats. It is not the grand vessel of a pharaoh, all painted and gilded, with rows of oars and a cabin of fine cedar. No, this is a working boat. It is made of acacia wood, or perhaps of tied bundles of papyrus, depending on how far back in time we are going. It is long and graceful, with a high prow that curves up like the neck of a bird. It has a sail made of linen that can catch the north wind when the wind is favorable, and it has oars for the times when the wind is not. And it is loaded with goods: jars of beer, jars of wine, baskets of figs and onions, bundles of linen rolled tight like sleeping children, copper tools, ropes of all thicknesses. It is a floating market, a traveling shop, a lifeline between the villages that are now scattered across the watery world like beads on a blue cloak. By nightfall, the boat has found a place to rest. The boatman has steered his vessel close to the shore of one of those island villages, and he has thrown a rope ashore. Someone has tied it to a palm trunk, or to a heavy stone, or to a wooden post that has been driven into the mud for just this purpose. The boat settles. It nudges against the bank, or rather against the submerged edge of the bank, with a soft, muffled thump. And now the question begins: where does the boatman sleep? You might think he would go ashore. And often, if the village was a friendly one and he had business there the next day, he might indeed spend the night in the house of a friend, or in the open courtyard of a temple, or simply on the high ground, wrapped in a cloak, with the stars wheeling overhead. But very often, the boatman stayed with his boat. A boat is a valuable thing. It is a man's livelihood, his home on the water, his partner in every journey. To leave it untended was to invite trouble. So the boatman slept aboard, and the way he slept aboard, night after night, through the long weeks of the flood, is what we are here to understand. Now, if you have ever spent a night on a boat, you know that it is a very particular kind of experience. The water does not stay still. It breathes. It shifts. It nudges the hull with 1,000 tiny, persistent touches. The boat responds with a language of creaks and groans, little murmurs of wood and rope and water that become, after a while, as familiar as a lullaby. But the boats of the ancient Nile were not like our boats. They were lighter, more flexible. You could feel every movement of the river in your bones. And when the flood was at its height, the river was not gentle. It was powerful, brown, and full of hidden things, and it moved with a quiet, muscular force that could carry a boat sideways, or swing it around on its rope, or press it against the bank with a pressure that would have been alarming if you were not used to it. The boatmen were used to it. They had to be. Their whole lives were shaped by this river, by its moods and its rhythms, by the certain knowledge that the water was in charge, and no amount of human stubbornness could change that. So when night came, and the flood water lapped against the sides of the boatman did not lie awake worrying. He lay down and he slept. But where did he lie? Let us step aboard, if you will, and look around. The boat is crowded with cargo, but the boatman has his own little space. Near the stern, where the steering oar is mounted, there is a small deck, or perhaps just a smooth area of planking, protected from the worst of the spray by a low bulwark. Here, the boatman keeps his personal things: a roll of matting, a cloak of coarse linen, or perhaps of wool if he was lucky, a small clay lamp with a wick of twisted flax burning a thin flame of castor oil, and a bundle of reeds tied together, which served as a pillow and as a cushion, and if the truth be told, as a very poor mattress for a man who had been hauling on ropes all day. He would unroll the matting. He would fold the cloak into a rough blanket. He would lie down with his head on the reeds and his feet toward the bow, so that the gentle rocking of the boat rolled him backward and forward along the length of his body, like a mother rocking a cradle. Some boatmen slept on top of the cargo, if the cargo was soft enough. If he was carrying a load of flax, or of wool, or of dried beans in sacks, a man could make a very comfortable nest among the bundles. But if the cargo was jars of beer, or blocks of stone, or anything hard and unforgiving, he stayed on the deck planks and make do with the matting. One boatman, we might imagine, a man of middle years, with a weathered face and hands like dried mud, had a particular spot he liked. It was just behind the mast, where the hull was broadest and the rocking was least. He said it was like sleeping on the belly of a fat woman. This was his joke, and he told it often, and the other boatmen laughed every time, because it was the kind of joke that gets funnier the more the river rocks you. But sleeping on a boat during the flood was not just a matter of finding a comfortable spot. There were other considerations. The most obvious was the rope. The rope that tied the boat to the shore was a living thing, a creature of muscle and fiber, and it needed to be checked constantly. The flood water was not static. It rose and fell, not by much, but by enough. And as the water level changed, the rope slackened or tautened. If it slackened too much, the boat would drift out into the current and bump against other boats, or against the submerged walls of the village, and that could wake a man up in a very unpleasant way. If it tautened too much, the rope could strain, and if it snapped, the boat would be carried away downriver, with the boatman inside, and he would wake to find himself in a completely different part of Egypt. So before he settled for the night, the boatman would tend to his rope. He would walk along the deck, feel the tension with his hands, and if necessary, he would pay out a little more line, or haul in a little, or tie a new knot. Some boatmen would dangle a small stone on a string over the side, and use it to judge whether the water was rising or falling, and adjust their ropes accordingly. It is a humble skill, this tending of ropes, but it is the difference between a peaceful night and a sleepless one. And then there was the matter of the bugs. The flood season was a time of extraordinary abundance in the waters of the Nile. The fish spawned, the frogs sang, and the mosquitoes, oh, the mosquitoes. They rose from the warm, shallow floodwater in clouds that could darken the air. For a man sleeping on a boat in the middle of this watery world, there was no escape. He could cover himself with a cloak, but the cloak kept him hot, and the mosquitoes found the smallest openings, the thinnest patches of cloth. He could smear himself with fat, or with mud, or with a concoction of herbs, and this helped a little, though the smell was not always pleasant. or he could simply accept it and learn to sleep through the whining hum, the little pricks, the tiny itches that were simply part of the night. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the mosquito, and it appears in their writings as a curse, a scourge. But the boatmen, who spent their lives on the river, had developed a certain tolerance. They said that the mosquitoes of the flood were fat and lazy because they had so much water to breed in. A mosquito that has drunk its fill does not bite. So perhaps the boatman's trick was to lie still and let the first few mosquitoes have their dinner and hope that the rest would follow their example. It is not a very scientific theory, but there is something to it. Let us think, too, about the sound of the night. Have you ever lain in bed and listened to water? Not the water of a faucet or a shower, but the water of a great river, alive with all the creatures that live in it. The flood season was a symphony. The frogs, as we have said, sang in a chorus that could be heard from miles away. A deep, pulsing, percussive throbbing that rose and fell with the phases of the moon. The fish jumped, and when they landed, they slapped the water with a sound like wet hands clapping. The reeds rustled, and the river itself, the endless flowing of the water, made a kind of bass note, a low hum of movement that the boatman felt not just with his ears, but with his whole body. And above all this, there was the sound of the other boats. Because the flood season brought many vessels onto the water, and many of them moored together for safety, the boatmen would tie up alongside each other, side by side, bow to stern, and they would form a kind of floating village. And in this village, there was conversation. There was laughter. There was the smell of cooking, as one boatman or another lit a small fire in a clay brazier and brewed tea, or warmed his dinner of bread and onions and salted fish. And as the night grew deeper, the conversations grew quieter, and one by one the fires were extinguished, and one by one the men lay down, and the floating village settled into a forest of masts and a network of ropes, all swaying gently together. And here, in this floating village, we can perhaps see how the boatmen slept. They slept close together, curled up against each other, sharing warmth and sharing the shadows of the boats. They slept with one hand on their rope, ready to tighten or loosen. They slept with their heads on bundles of reeds, on folded cloaks, on rolled up sails. And they slept with their ears half open, attuned to the smallest change in the sound of the water. A good boatman could tell from the sound of the waves against the hull whether the wind had changed, whether the current was strengthening, whether a sandbank was shifting. He could hear, in his half-sleep, the approach of another boat, and he would know, without fully waking, whether it was a friendly trader or a vessel to be wary of. This is a skill that we have largely lost. We sleep so deeply, in our beds on solid ground, and we do not need to know the language of water. But the boatmen of the flood season were different. Their sleep was light and deep at the same time. Light enough to notice, deep enough to rest. There is a particular kind of intimacy that develops between a man and a boat when they have spent many nights together. The boat knows the man's weight. It knows where he walks, where he sits, where he lies down. And the man knows the boat. He knows which plank groans, which rope stretches, which part of the deck is dry and warm, and which part collects a puddle of cold water. By the time the flood season had lasted a few weeks, the boatman and his boat were a single breathing creature. The boatman would settle into his spot, and the boat would adjust itself around him. The rocking would slow, as if the boat understood that it was time to rest. The creaking would soften, and the man would drift off to the tune of the lap, lap, lap of the water against the hull, with the stars wheeling slowly overhead and the frogs singing their endless, comforting chorus. But the flood was not without its dangers, and it would be dishonest of me to suggest that every night was peaceful. There were sudden storms. The Nile Valley, in the late summer, could be raked by violent winds that came down from the north in great rushing gusts. The water would turn black and whip into short, steep waves that battered the little boats. A boatman would wake to hear his rigging slapping, his cargo shifting, his boat straining at its rope, and he would be up in an instant, barefoot on the wet deck, his heart hammering, his hands moving with practiced speed to secure the sail, to double the knots, to hold the ropes steady until the storm passed. These were the nights when the boatmen did not sleep. They sat, huddled in their cloaks, watching the sky, feeling the shudder of the boat beneath them, and waiting for the dawn. And when the dawn came, and the wind died, and the water smoothed out again, the exhaustion was complete, and yet the world was beautiful. The sunrise over the flooded Nile was a sight that no boatman ever tired of. The water turned pink, then gold, then a brilliant sheet of silver, and the village islands appeared to float in the light, and the birds rose from the reeds in vast, grateful flocks. And yet, for all these moments of danger, the flood season was, for the boatmen, a kind of holiday from the land. Think about the lives of most people in ancient Egypt. They were tied to the fields, to the rhythm of planting and harvesting. Their days were long, their work was hard, and their food, while plentiful, was predictable. But the boatmen were different. They were travelers. They saw things that the farmers never saw. They visited the great cities, the cities of Thebes and Memphis and Abydos, where the temples rose like mountains of stone, and the markets burst with goods from the entire known world. They heard news. They told stories. And during the flood, when the land was underwater, they were the kings of the watery realm. They sailed where they pleased, within reason. They carried the messages, the goods, the people who needed to move from one island village to another. And at night, they slept in a world that was entirely their own. Let us think about the kind of men these boatmen were. We know them from the records, from the letters and the lists, and the legal documents that have survived. Some were independent, owning their own boats, hiring themselves out for particular journeys. Others worked for the state, for the temple, for the great estates. The boatman's craft was passed down from father to son, and there were families who had been on the river for generations. They were a separate people, in a way. They had their own slang, their own jokes, their own feuds and friendships. They married women from the river towns, and their children learned to swim almost before they could walk. And they never entirely trusted, deep in their bones, the solid, unmoving ground. One ancient writer tells us, in a somewhat exasperated tone, that the boatmen of the Nile were a stubborn and superstitious lot. They believed in omens. They made small offerings to the river gods before every journey: a pinch of bread, a drop of beer, a few grains of salt, cast into the water with a murmur of words. They hung amulets from their boats, shells and beads and bits of colored stone, and they would not, on any account, begin a journey on a day that they considered unlucky. The writer finds this foolish, but the boatmen would not have cared what he thought. They knew the river, and the river, they said, was alive. It had moods, it had preferences, and it repaid those who treated it with respect. When darkness fell during the flood season, the boatman would sometimes say a small prayer before he lay down. He would not make a show of it. Just a few words, whispered into the night, asking the river to hold him gently, to keep the rope strong, to grant him a few hours of untroubled rest. And then he would lie down, and the river, which had heard this prayer 10,000 times from 10,000 boatmen, would murmur its answer in the language of water. It would rock him. It would sing to him. It would wrap the boat in a soft embrace of current and flow, and the boatman would sleep. Now, I want to take a little time to compare this to something that might be familiar to you. You may remember from your own experience a night spent on a boat, a cabin on a lake, a slow river cruise where you lay in a narrow bunk and watched the ceiling while the engine hummed below. Or perhaps a night in a tent by the water where you could hear the waves through the thin fabric. There's something about water that changes the quality of sleep. You do not sleep less well, but you sleep differently. Your dreams are more liquid. Your waking is more gradual. The boundary between sleeping and waking becomes softer, more blurred. And this is exactly what the ancient boatmen knew. They did not fight the water. They surrendered to it. They understood that a boat is not a place where you simply sleep, but a place where you learn a new way of sleeping. How then did they manage the practical small things? Let us consider the matter of getting up in the middle of the night. When you wake in a bed on dry land, you know exactly where you are. The floor is solid. The walls are fixed. But on a boat, everything moves. A boatman who woke to relieve himself had to be very careful. He could not simply step out of bed. He had to find his footing, test the deck, hold onto the gunwale. And if the boat was moored alongside other boats, he had to cross from deck to deck, stepping over ropes, ducking under booms in the dark, with the water lapping below him. Some boatmen, on nights when the water was calm, were said to be able to walk from one end of a raft of boats to the other without waking a single man. They knew each boat, each rope, each little patch of deck that was safe. They moved like cats, or like water itself. It is a small thing, perhaps, but it is a skill that took years to develop. And it was one of the many reasons why an experienced boatman was so valued. And what about the cold? You might imagine that Egypt is always warm, but the desert nights can be surprisingly cool. During the flood season, the water itself holds the warmth of the day, and so the nights are not as cold as they might be. But still, a man lying on a plank deck with only a thin cloak would feel the chill in the small hours before dawn. The boatmen dealt with this in a simple, social way. They slept close together, not because they lacked space, but because bodies generate warmth. We have evidence in the art of ancient Egypt of boatmen sleeping curled up together, 2 or 3 men in a single nest of matting, their heads pillowed on each other's shoulders. There is something touching about this image. These were hard men, rough men, men who could curse and fight and haul on ropes until their hands bled. But at night, they slept like puppies in a heap, trusting each other with their warmth, their safety, their dreams. Let me tell you a small story. It is not a story from any ancient text, because the ancient boatmen did not write down such things. They did not leave us their diaries or their memoirs. But it is the kind of story that we can reconstruct, the kind of story that must have happened 1,000 times. Imagine a boatman. Let us call him Seneb. Seneb is in his 40s, and he has been on the river since he was a boy, when his father lifted him onto the deck of his own boat and told him to hold the rope. Seneb has a boat of his own now. It is old, but it is sound. It has carried him through many floods and many seasons of low water. Tonight, he has moored his boat near a village on the edge of the flood. He has delivered a load of pottery and taken on a load of dried fish. Tomorrow he will sail south, back to his hometown, where his wife and children are waiting. But tonight, he is alone on his boat, except for the boy who has come with him, a young man of about 16, the son of his sister, who is learning the trade. They have eaten their evening meal, bread and onions and a little cheese, and they have drunk their beer, which is weak and slightly sour, and they have said their prayers. The boy has settled in the bow, where he has made himself a bed among the coils of rope. Seneb has taken his place at the stern. The stars are beginning to come out, one by one, and the water is dark and smooth. The frogs are just starting their evening chorus. The village, a few hundred yards away, is a dark smudge on the horizon, with a few pinpricks of light where the cooking fires have not yet burned out. Seneb lies on his back, his hands folded on his chest, his head on the bundle of reeds. He can feel the boat moving beneath him, a slow, gentle rocking. He can hear the boy's breathing, already regular and deep. He thinks about the day that has passed and the day that will come. And then, without any conscious effort, he lets go. His thoughts become softer, more distant. The sounds of the night fade into a single, continuous hum, and Seneb sleeps. This is what we are really talking about tonight. Not just the mechanics of sleeping on a boat, but the quality of the sleep itself. The way that these men, who lived so closely with the river, were able to find rest in the middle of such a strange and watery world. They did not have our comfortable mattresses, our soft pillows, our dark, quiet rooms. They had planks and ropes and the relentless presence of water. And yet, in their own way, they slept well, perhaps better than we do. Because they had no artificial light to tell their bodies it was still daytime, no screens to interrupt their sleep with news and noise, no worries about the future beyond the next day, the next journey, the next rope to be checked. The rhythm of their lives was set by the river, and the river, for all its power, was a creature of habit. It rose, it fell, it flowed, And the boatmen rose with it, and fell with it, and flowed with it, and slept. There is a kind of wisdom in this. We carry so much with us. We fill our heads with plans and anxieties, lie down at night, and our minds keep churning, turning over the events of the day, rehearsing the conversations of tomorrow. But the boatmen could not afford this. They lived too close to the edge, too close to the water. If they did not sleep, they would be useless the next day. And being useless on a boat in the middle of a flood was not an option. So they learned a discipline that we have forgotten. They learned how to put down their burdens, piece by piece, like a man unloading his boat at the end of a journey. They learned how to let the day slip away, how to fix their thoughts on something simple and slow, how to let the rocking of the water carry them into rest. And lying here in our own beds, with the stories of the night wrapped around us, we can perhaps borrow a little of this. We can feel the gentle movement of our own breath, rising and falling like the water against the hull. We can let our thoughts soften, the way the flood softened the hard edges of the land. And we can slip, slowly and quietly, toward a sleep as deep and as peaceful as that of the boatmen of the Nile. But the night is not over yet. There are more stories to tell, and we have only begun to explore this watery world. We have learned a little about how the boatmen slept, but there is more. We have yet to visit the great boats of the state, the grain ships, and the temple vessels, and see how their crews settled among the sacks of wheat. We have yet to meet the women who lived on the river, the boatmen's wives and daughters, who knew the waterways as well as any man. We have yet to imagine the strange dreams that come to a man who sleeps on water during a flood. Dreams of submerged fields and sunken temples. Dreams that blurred the boundary between the world above the surface and the world below. And we have yet to consider the question of what happens when the flood begins to recede and the land appears again, and the boatmen must learn to navigate among the mudbanks and the shallows. But those stories are for the moments ahead. For now, let us rest a moment with Seneb and his nephew and their little boat riding at anchor on the wide, dark, living water. Let us feel the rope tied to the palm trunk, holding them safe. Let us listen to the frogs and the fish and the endless whispering current. And let us remember that we too are travelers, carried along by the patient river of the night, moving gently and without fear toward whatever comes next. Let us leave Seneb's boat very gently so as not to wake him. There is no need to move our feet. We can float the way the night itself floats, rising just a little above the water, drifting from one dark shape to another. The flood has spread out across the land, and the boatmen have followed it. They have tied their boats to palm trunks that now stand ankle deep in water. They have tied them to the stairways of villages that have become islands. Some have tied them to each other, side by side, until a whole fleet of little watercraft lies together like a family of sleeping cattle. And in every one of these boats, or nearly every one, there is a man or a boy or a woman curled up in a nest of reeds and rope, breathing slowly, with the water moving underneath them. If we glide further south, past the little villages and the fields that have disappeared beneath the brown flood, we begin to see the bigger boats, the great grain ships, the temple vessels, the barges of the king. They lie at anchor in the deeper channels, looking almost like floating islands themselves. One of these ships is 100 feet long, maybe more, built of heavy timber, with a great curve at the bow and a steering oar at the stern that is longer than a man. It has carried grain from the fields of the south to the granaries of the north, and now it sits waiting, heavy and still, while the flood does its work. At first glance, it might seem like a very different world from the little boat of Seneb. And yet, if we draw close, we will see the same rope, the same woven matting, the same human shapes asleep on the deck. The crews of these great ships were not very different from the boatmen of the small ones. They had the same calloused hands, the same sun-darkened faces, the same habit of speaking softly when the night was quiet, as if the water might be listening. If we could look down upon the deck of this great ship, we would see something like a field of sleeping men. They have made their beds among the cargo. The sacks of wheat are stacked in the middle of the deck, and the crew have settled into the hollows between them, so that a man might lie with a sack of grain for a pillow and another sack of grain for a wall. It sounds uncomfortable to us, but the grain has been warmed by the sun all day, and it holds that warmth through the night. It also gives off a smell, a dry, dusty, sweet smell, like bread baking in an oven that is still far away. The men who sleep among the grain have grown used to this smell. They do not notice it any more than they notice the sound of the water. But we, if we could lean close, would find it strange and pleasant, and we might understand why the sailors of the big ships were known to talk in their sleep about harvests and golden fields. There's a trick to sleeping on a load of grain, and the old sailors knew it. You do not lie flat on your back, because the sacks are uneven, and they will make you roll into the gap between them. You do not lie on your side, unless you have a sack to lean against on either side. The best way is to lie in the hollow, with your knees slightly bent, as if you were sitting in a chair that has somehow tilted over. In this position, the grain holds you, just as the water holds the ship. And when the ship rocks, and the sacks shift a little, you shift with them gradually, gently, like a sack of grain being settled into place. Some of the older sailors could sleep through a full storm this way, and wake up with the impression that they had been rocked in the arms of a giant. Now, you might think that the officers of the ship, the captain and the overseer, would have some claim to a better sleeping place. And they did. They had a small cabin at the stern, or at least a raised platform with a curtain of matting around it. They were not sleeping on the bare deck, but on layers of woven cloth with a proper headrest made of wood. The headrest is something we should pause over, because it tells us a great deal about how the ancient Egyptians thought about sleep. We sleep with our heads on soft pillows, deep and giving. They slept with their necks resting against a curved block of wood, raised off the ground, and it seems to us that this would be impossibly uncomfortable. But the ancient Egyptians believed that the head was sacred, and that it should be kept raised and cool and protected while the rest of the body rested. They also believed in protecting the head with magic. Some headrests were carved with images of the god Bes, or inscribed with spells against the nightmares that come out of the dark, the things that whisper and scratch at the edges of a sleeping mind. So, even on a great state ship, the captain would rest his head upon a little wooden altar, and he believed that it would keep his dreams safe. The crew, of course, did not have such luxuries. They used folded cloth or their own arms, or sometimes a bundle of reeds tied with twine. But they had something that the captain, in his private cabin, did not have. They had closeness. They had the warmth of other bodies. And they had the quiet companionship of men who have worked together, struggled together, and eaten together, and who now lie side by side in the darkness, each one knowing that the others are there. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from sleeping among a group of people you trust completely. It is the peace of the animal pack, the herd, the flock. It is the peace of knowing that there are eyes to watch, ears to hear, and hands to act, even while you close your own eyes and let go. The watched man sleeps deeper than the watching man, and the boatmen took turns watching all through the night so that the others could sleep without fear. In the darkness, we might see the lookout, a young man perhaps, stationed in the bow, where the great rope curls on the deck. He is not standing. He is sitting cross-legged, his cloak drawn around him, his eyes fixed on the black water. He is watching for the unexpected, for the floating tree trunk, the fragment of a village house, the sodden body of a cow that has been caught by the flood. The flood moves quickly, and there is little time to react. But the boat is anchored, so perhaps the lookout is watching more for the movement of the flood itself, feeling how the water pulls, noting whether the anchor is holding. He hums a little tune, something low and wordless. It is a sound that we might almost mistake for the song of a night bird, and in the morning he will wake the others, and the great ship will continue on its way. But let us not linger too long on the state ships and their cargoes. They are impressive, but they are not the heart of this story. The heart of this story is the river, and the river refuses to be impressed by size or cargo. It carries the little boats and the great boats with the same indifferent patience. And it carries us too, as we drift away from the grain ships and toward a different kind of boat, a quieter one, a smaller one, tied at the edge of a village that has become an island. This is a boat where we will meet the women of the river. There is a common notion, when we think of ancient Egypt, that the roles were very clear. The men went out to work, whether in the fields or on the water. The women stayed at home, weaving, cooking, raising the children. And there is some truth in this, but the home itself was not always on dry land. On the river, there were families who lived almost entirely on their boats, moving from one place to another with the seasons, trading, fishing, and carrying goods. For these families, the boat was the home. It had the cooking hearth, the clay pots, the rolled-up mats, the woven baskets of clothes, and it had the woman who ruled over it, who knew the deck as well as her husband, who could coil a rope as neatly as any man, who could read the sky for weather, and who, when the boat needed to be moved, could take the steering oar and guide the vessel through the narrow channels with a calm that might surprise you. Her name, let us say, is Nebbit. She is the wife of a fisherman, and she lives with him on a boat that is not much larger than Seneb, and perhaps even more worn. There are 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and the whole family sleeps in the single small space in the middle of the boat, under a loosely woven awning that keeps off the worst of the dew. Nebbit is a middle-aged woman now, with gray threading through her black hair, and a face that is lined and wise. She has been sleeping on this boat with her husband for 25 years, and she knows every creak and groan of its timbers, just as she knows the snores and murmurs of her husband. When the flood comes, as it does every year, Nebbit does not complain. The water rises around their little boat, and they move it closer to the village, where there are other boats, other families, other voices. The flood is a time of gathering. The fields are underwater, so the fishermen find other work, carrying passengers and goods. The children, of course, are thrilled. The flood turns the world into a shallow sea, and they play at the edges, splashing and chasing each other in small papyrus rafts. But for Nebbit, the flood is simply a time when the sleeping is a little more crowded. The family lies close together in the small cabin. She can stretch out her hand and touch her youngest son's head or her husband's shoulder. And in the warm, dark, rocking space, she feels the whole of her life gathered around her, like the floodwaters gathered around the little boat. The women of the river, we should say, were not just the wives and daughters of fishermen and boatmen. Some of them were boatwomen in their own right, traders and sellers, moving goods from village to village. They knew the waterways the way a farmer knows his fields. They knew where the current ran fast, where it ran slow, where the hidden sandbanks were, where the reeds grew thick. They could handle a boat as well as any man, and there is perhaps no better evidence of this than the fact that the ancient Egyptians themselves wrote about it. In the marketplaces along the river, it was often the women who stood at the bows of the trading boats, calling out their prices, bargaining with the merchants on the shore, and keeping the little cargo of onions or fish or woven baskets safe and dry. At night, these women moored their boats and made their supper over a small charcoal fire. And then they slept, as all boatmen slept, curled up in a corner of the deck, with their goods stacked beside them, and their hand resting on the tiller, even in their dreams. What strange dreams these women must have had. Dreams of the market, dreams of the river, dreams of children who had wandered too close to the water. Perhaps they did not dream at all, for they were too tired. There's a kind of sleep that comes after a long day of loading and unloading, of haggling and hauling, that is deeper than any dream. It is a blank, dark, healing sleep, and the women of the river knew it well. They slept the way children sleep after a long day of play, completely, utterly still, their faces soft, their breath slow, their bodies rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of the boat. And in the morning, they woke with the first light, and they built up the fire, and the day began again. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about sleep on the river during the flood is this. The flood was not a disaster. It was not a tragedy. It was the most expected and most welcome event of the year, and because it was expected, there was no panic in the sleeping. The boatmen did not lie awake worrying about the water. They knew the flood. They knew how high it would rise, and when, and how long it would stay. They knew that the rope would hold. They knew that the boat would not sink. They knew that the flood would recede in its own time and leave behind a layer of rich, dark mud that would make the fields bloom. And so they slept, not despite the flood, but because of it. The flood was the time when the river was fullest, when the world was softest, when the boats sat high and free. It was, in a sense, the easiest time to sleep afloat. The water was deep enough that the boat did not bump against the bottom. The current was steady, but not violent in the calm backwaters where they moored. And the air was filled with moisture, a soft, humid blanket that kept the nights from becoming too cold. We might think that a man who sleeps on a boat during a flood would dream of drowning. But the ancient Egyptians had a different relationship with water. They did not fear the flood because they saw it as a gift from the gods. And they did not fear the water itself because they understood that it was the source of all life. They even had a god who was the flood, Happy, a figure with full breasts and a belly like a fertile field, bringer of food and abundance. To sleep on the flood was to be held in the hands of Happy. It was to be cradled in the same waters that made the barley grow, that fed the cattle, that filled the jars of the temple. And so the dreams of the boatmen, when they came, were not dreams of drowning. They were dreams of growth, of green fields, of the Nile as a great mother, murmuring and singing to her children. And yet, there is another kind of dream that overtakes a man who sleeps on the water. It comes in the deepest part of the night, when the flood has covered everything, and there is nothing to see but the vast black mirror of the water, and nothing to hear but the gentle lapping against the hull. In such a night, the boundaries of the world become uncertain. The land is gone. The familiar roads and paths are gone. The fields where you walked as a boy are hidden beneath the flood. And the boatman, lying on his deck, looking up at the stars, might begin to feel that he has drifted out of the world of the living altogether into a different realm, a realm of water and stars and silence. It is a feeling that we might recognize in our own quiet nights, when the house is dark and still, and the familiar furniture stands ghostly in the shadows, and we feel, for a moment, as if we have been carried away to somewhere else entirely. The ancient Egyptians had a name for this watery realm. They called it Nun, the primordial ocean, the dark, endless, life-giving water that existed before the world was created. Every night, when the sun set, it descended into Nun and traveled through the underworld and was renewed and was born again at dawn. And the boatmen, on their little boats in the middle of the flood, were as close to Nun as any living person. The water beneath them was more than just the Nile. It was a continuation of that original ocean, a remnant of the beginning of time. And to sleep on, it was to sleep on the very edge of the world, to float above the womb of creation. You might ask whether the boatmen themselves had such grand thoughts. Perhaps not in words, but in the body, in the deep, settled calm that came over them when they lay down on the deck They knew. They knew that the water holding them up was old, old beyond reckoning. They knew that it had come from somewhere far away, out of the darkness of the south, out of the mountains where the world was raw and new. And they knew that it made them safe, not despite the darkness, but because of it. Let us spend a little time with this darkness. It is not a frightening darkness. It is the darkness of a room where the lamp has been covered. It is thick and soft, and it holds the body like a blanket. On a clear night, with the stars out, the water is not black. It is a deep blue-gray, scattered with the trembling reflections of the stars, so that the boatman lying on his deck seems to float in the middle of a second sky. Above him, the stars. Below him, the stars. It is a little dizzying, perhaps, and it can make a man feel that he has lost his sense of up and down. But this is not unpleasant. It is like lying on the back and looking up into the high blue of the sky, when the blue seems to open and open and open, and you feel that you might simply float upward into it. On the water, with the reflected stars, the upward and the downward are not so different. The boatman floats between them, suspended, free. He is a star himself, perhaps, carried along the river of the night, on his journey from one horizon to another. There is a story from a much later time, but a story that captures this feeling wonderfully. It is about a man who fell asleep on his boat during a flood, and when he woke, he could not tell whether he was awake or dreaming. He was lying on his back, and above him was the sky full of stars, and below him, through the planks of the boat, he could hear the water moving. And he thought, I have died, and I am floating away to the afterworld. But he was not dead. He was only a boatman who had worked too hard and slept too deeply, and woken in the middle of the night, and forgotten for a moment where he was. He felt a great peace, he said afterward, a peace that is not of this world. And even when he realized that he was alive, and on the river, and the sky was just a sky, he kept a little of that peace with him, like a stone in his pocket, and he would take it out and look at it in the hard, dry days when the water was low and the land was bare. We might listen to the water as we lie here in our own beds and try to let it carry us the same way. The water has a voice. It does not speak in words, but it has a cadence, a rhythm, a gentle, endless murmur that is very like a lullaby. It says, you are here. It says, you are held. It says, there is nothing that needs to be done at this moment, nothing that needs to be fixed, nothing that needs to be feared. The water does not hurry. It does not worry. It moves at the pace of the moon, slow and steady, and it sleeps in its own way as it waits for the great wheel of the year to turn. And the boatmen who knew this were wise enough to sleep with the water, not against it. They did not try to fight the rocking. They let it rock them. They did not try to silence the lapping and the splashing. They let it lull them. They gave themselves to the river, and the river gave them sleep. But there is one more aspect of this flood season sleeping that we must consider before we can truly close our eyes and slip away. It is the sound of the night, not the water, but everything else. You might think that the flood would silence the world. The fields are covered, so there are no birds pecking in the stubble. The roads are covered, so there are no carts rattling along the lanes. The flood strips the land bare of its usual business, but it does not strip it bare of life. And the night, far from being silent, is filled with voices. First, there are the frogs. To understand the frogs of the Egyptian flood, you must understand that they are not like the coy, quiet frogs of a northern pond. They are enthusiastic. They are devoted to their singing. When the flood water rises, the frogs are overjoyed, and they begin their concert, a sound that is not unlike 1,000 small wooden rattles being shaken at once. It is not a delicate sound. It penetrates the hull of the boat and the matting and the ears of the sleeping boatmen. And yet, it is a sound that the boatmen have heard since birth, and it has become, for them, a kind of white noise, a wall of sound that blocks out the smaller, more alarming noises of the night. When the frogs are singing, the boatman can be sure that nothing is creeping up on him. The frogs would fall silent if there were danger. And so their racket, paradoxically, is the most soothing and reassuring sound in the world. The boatmen fall asleep to the song of the frogs, the way we fall asleep to the hum of a fan or the whisper of trees outside the window. Then there are the birds, the water birds of the Nile, the herons, the ibis, the kingfishers, settle in the reeds and the drowned bushes, and they talk among themselves as night falls. They make small, clicking, muttering sounds, like a family getting comfortable before sleep. Sometimes one will lift off with a late flap of wings and fly across the moon, and the boatman, watching with half-closed eyes, will follow it until it disappears, and then his eyes will close again. And there are the fish. You might be surprised to hear fish, but in the calm floodwater, fish will sometimes leap or push their heads above the surface to take a breath of air, making a soft, wet sound, a kind of smack or plop or gulp. In the night, these sounds are like the sounds of distant doors opening and closing, or distant hands clapping. They are irregular, unpredictable, and yet they do not keep the boatman awake. They are absorbed into the texture of the night, part of the great, patient web of water and life. And there is the sound of the village, if the boat is moored near one. The village, too, settles into sleep. The dogs bark once or twice, then fall silent. A woman sings to a fretful child, a short, winding tune that might be for a child or might be for herself. The sound of the singing carries across the water, thin and clear, and the boatman, hearing it, thinks of his own home, his own wife, his own children, and his heart softens. There are the braying donkeys, who seem to sleep standing up, and who sometimes dream and bray out loud in their sleep, a harsh, broken, terrible sound, but so familiar that it does not even disturb the surface of the boatman's sleep. And when the village is dark and the fires have all burned down, there is nothing left but the tiny, steady sound of insects, a high, thin, continuous thread of sound that seems to tie the night together, from the dark water to the dark sky. We said we would tell you about the dreams of the flood, and surely you have been wondering about them. What does a man dream about when he sleeps on water during the flood, in the presence of the ancient, life-giving river? Let us try to picture it, not from any text, but from the shape of his life. He has spent his waking hours looking at water. He has watched the river for signs, for changes in color and current. He has watched the sky for weather. He has watched the horizon for the smoke of a village, the flash of a white sail, the bend of a palm tree. His whole world is water and sky, and the small, dry world of the boat. And so, his dreams are not like ours. They are not filled with screens and halls and streets. They are filled with water. He dreams that he is floating through a landscape that is half submerged. The tops of the trees stand above the water, and his boat glides between them as if it were a fish weaving through a forest of seaweed. Here and there, the roof of a mud brick house rises like a small island, and he can see a goat standing on it, staring at him with yellow eyes. He dreams that he is sailing over his own fields, the fields where he played as a boy, but they are drowned, and the barley waves far below the surface, green and ghostly, and he can see fish swimming through the stalks. He dreams that he has dropped something into the water, a cup, a coin, a rope, and he dives down after it, down and down and down, and the water grows darker and cooler, and he can feel the pressure in his ears, and he can hear his own heartbeat, and he reaches out his hand and touches something soft, something that might be a hand, and he wakes with his own hand stretched out in the dark, and one of the other boatmen is sleeping beside him, and it is all right. There are dreams of the gods too, though a boatman might not be surprised by them. The flood is a time when the gods seem close. The ancient Egyptians believed that the flood was the water of Nu, the primeval ocean, and that the gods moved through it, unseen, powerful. A boatman sleeping on the flood might dream that he is being carried by a huge, gentle hand, a hand made of water, a hand as wide as the river. And he looks up, and the hand belongs to a figure too vast to see, a figure that is the river itself, the Nile, the great god Happy, coming to visit the land and bless it with abundance. Or he might dream that he is on a boat made of light, sailing through the sky, following the sun god as he journeys through the darkness. And he grips the side of the boat, and he is not afraid, because he has spent his whole life on the water, and he knows that the water will hold him, whether it is the water of the river or the water of the sky. But not all the dreams of the boatmen were gentle. The flood was powerful, and it could be destructive. There were stories passed around the cooking fires of boats that had been caught in the sudden surge, of men who had fallen into the rushing water and never been seen again. And the boatmen, knowing these stories, might dream of such things. They might dream of the rope snapping and the boat drifting away from the shore, and the dark water pulling them towards some terrible place, some whirlpool at the end of the world, where the river falls into a hole and never comes out. They might dream of the flood rising higher and higher, covering the palm tops, covering the roofs, covering the high ground, until nothing is left but water and the sky and the boat and the lonely, drowning stars. They might wake from such dreams with a cry, groping in the dark for the rope, for the boat's edge, for warmth, for reassurance, and the other men, waking beside him, would grunt and mutter, and one of them would say, "You were dreaming of the water," and he would say, "I dream of the water every night," and the other would say, "Then go back to sleep and dream of something better." And he would smile, and they would sleep. But these dark dreams were not so common as you might think. The boatmen were practical men, and their minds, like their bodies, were toughened by the river. They did not dwell on the dangers. They took their precautions, they said their prayers, and they slept. And even when they dreamed, their dreams were not very different from their waking lives. They dreamed of hauling ropes, of carrying sacks, of steering through the channels, of the faces of their families. The flood was their world, and they moved through it, whether awake or asleep, with the same stoic competence. The great difference, perhaps, was a kind of lightness. In their dreams, they were not weighed down by the heaviness of the body. They could fly a little. They could move through the water without swimming. They could pass through the sides of the boat like smoke. And when they woke, in the blue-gray light of dawn, they felt a strange tenderness, a softness in the chest, as if they had been touched by something they could not quite remember. Then the day's work began, and the softness passed, and the memory faded until the next night, when the dreams came again. Let us now, in our own slow way, consider what happens when the flood begins to go down. It does not happen all at once. The water, which rose over many weeks, now falls over many weeks. It is not a dramatic change. The boatman wakes one morning, and he notices that the water line on the trunk of the palm tree is a little lower than it was yesterday. Or he notices that the sound of the current is different, less full, less confident. The great, broad expanse of the flood is beginning to shrink, to contract, to reveal, here and there, a piece of land. And the boatman feels in his bones the change. The world is becoming solid again. The water is becoming a river again instead of a sea. And the time of floating is nearly over. This is a time when the boatman must be very careful. The receding water creates new dangers. Sandbanks appear where there was open water. The channels shift, and a route that was deep last week is now shallow. The mud, exposed to the air, dries and cracks into strange patterns. The boatmen adjust their moorings, moving their boats closer to the retreating channel, so that they will not be left stranded when the water falls away. They poke the bottom with long poles, feeling for the depth, reading the shape of the river with their hands, the way a blind man reads the face of a friend. And at night, as they lie down to sleep, there is a new sound, the sound of the boat settling. When the water is deep, the boat floats free, and it rocks with every movement. But when the water is low, the boat begins to touch the mud. It grinds softly against the bottom. It tilts just a little. And the boatman, lying in his bed, feels the change. It is like the difference between lying in bed in a ship and lying in bed in a house. The movement is less free. There is a bump. There is a tilt. There is a settling, a coming to rest. Some of the boats, when the flood goes down, are left on dry land. This must have been a strange experience for the boatman, to wake up after a lifetime at sea and find that your boat is a house. The water is gone. There is mud all around, drying and cracking in the sun. The boat lies on its side, gently tilting, like a dead whale on a beach. And the boatman, if he has been living on his boat through the flood, must move ashore or wait for the next flood to lift him back up. But this is not a cause for despair. The boat, resting on the mud, will be repaired and cleaned, and the long, slow work of the dry season will begin. And the boatman will sleep, not on the rocking water, but on the firm, unmoving land. And his dreams will be different. Dreams of the water, yes, but the water will be distant, remembered, something that moves elsewhere while he stays still. We can think of this as a kind of death and rebirth. The flood brings life, and the flood takes it away. The boat rises with the water, and the boat sinks with the water. And through it all, the boatman sleeps, trusting the river, trusting the boat, trusting his own body to rise and fall with the great slow tide of the year. He does not fight change. He does not cling to one state of being. He accepts that the water will rise, and he floats. He accepts that the water will fall, and he settles. In this way, he is a teacher for all of us. We who cling, who struggle, who lie awake at night trying to control what cannot be controlled. We could learn from the boatman. We could learn to float and to settle and to sleep in the great, patient rhythm of the world. And as we reach the end of this long night, we find ourselves returning softly to where we began. To Seneb's little boat, moored near the village, with the boy asleep in the bow and Seneb asleep in the stern. The flood is still here. The water is still dark and smooth. The frogs are singing, and the stars are turning overhead. It is the deepest part of the night, the hour when sleep is heaviest, when the dreams are thickest, when the boundary between the living and the dreaming is most slight. And Seneb is dreaming. He is dreaming that he is sailing across a plain of water that stretches to the edge of the world. He is dreaming that his boat is a leaf, and that the current is a gentle breath, and that he is being carried not to any particular place, but simply to the morning. He is dreaming of the smell of bread, of the sound of his wife's voice, of the faces of his children. He is dreaming of home, which is a place where you can sleep and wake and know yourself. And we, too, are being carried. Our own beds are our boats, and the night is our river, and we are floating slowly, gently toward the dawn. We can let go. We can unclench our hands and soften our eyes and loosen the thoughts that have been holding us up. We can breathe, and as we breathe, we can feel the same deep rhythm that carries the water, that carries the earth, that carries the sleeping boatmen of the Nile. We are not alone. We are held. The night is a flood, and we are on the water, and the water has known us from the beginning, and it is not going to let us go. So let us drift. Let us sink just a little into the warm, dark depth, and let us sleep the way Seneb slept, the way the river sleeps, the way the flood sleeps, in its long, slow breath between one season and the next. Good night, traveler. Good night, boatman. Good night, river. The stars are watching, and the boat is safe, and there is nothing left to do but rest and be carried and wait for the light. Now, let us pause here as the night itself pauses, in that deep hour when even the frogs seem to hold their breath. We have said our good nights, and yet the story is not quite finished. there is a little more we might consider before we allow our eyes to close completely and our minds to drift into their own quiet harbors. For the night, as you may have noticed, has its own long patience, and it does not mind if we stay awake a little longer, thinking, remembering, imagining. So let us linger just a little in the company of the boatmen and see what other secrets they might share with us in the dark upon the water. Let us return for a moment to the quality of the boatman's sleep. You might think that a man who sleeps on a wooden deck with only a rolled cloth for a pillow would not sleep deeply, but the opposite was true. The boatmen of the Nile slept with a stillness and a completeness that we, in our soft beds, might envy. Their bodies were conditioned by the day's labor. When they lay down, the fatigue of the arms and the back and the legs rose up like a warm mist and carried them under. They did not need to count sheep or to quiet their minds with practiced exercises. They simply lay down, closed their eyes, and fell into the arms of the night as a child falls into a pile of hay. The weight of their work, the heat of the sun, the strain of the rope, and the pole and the steering oar, all of it dissolved into the darkness, and they sank down into a thick, heavy rest that was not easily disturbed. This is not to say that they slept without moving. The sleep of a working man is not motionless. It is full of small twitches and turns, the body settling into its restlessness, the muscles releasing their knots one by one. A leg would kick out softly, as if pushing against a remembered current. Hand would curl and uncurl. A jaw would grind slowly in the rhythm of some forgotten meal. And beneath this, there was always the boat. The boats of the Nile were not great ships with cabins and bulkheads. They were open vessels, often with a gentle curve, wide in the beam, with a deck that was just wide enough for a man to lie down with his arms at his sides, or to curl up with his knees near his chin. And the water beneath the boat was perpetually alive. It swayed, and the boat answered with a sway of its own. This gentle rocking was so constant, so regular, so much the rhythm of the world, that the boatmen's bodies became attuned to it. They slept as you might sleep in a cradle, if you had been born in a cradle that never stopped moving. There were moments when the rocking would cease. The boat would rub against the sandy bottom, or one of the men would wake and change his weight, and the hull would go still. And in that stillness, the sleeper would stir, just barely, as if his body had felt the absence of something it loved. He might murmur or turn over, or open his eyes for a fraction of a second, seeing the stars through two blurry slits before the rocking resumed, and he sank back into the soft swell of sleep. It was a sleep that was alive, as the river is alive, as the flood is alive. And in the morning, when the boatmen woke, they did not feel the grogginess that we sometimes feel, that heavy, reluctant pull away from the pillow. They woke all at once, like animals, their eyes snapping open, their bodies rising without complaint, ready for the day. Because their sleep had not been a retreat from life, it had been a deep, continuous conversation with the movement of the water. They had not left the world. They had only rested within it. And what of the mosquitoes, you might ask? Ah, the mosquitoes. They were as much a part of the Nile at night as the stars. A boatman lying on his deck would hear them as a thin, high whine, circling his ears, probing the darkness, searching for warmth. The more he tried to ignore them, the louder they seemed to become. And yet, the boatmen had their methods. Some would smear their arms and faces with river mud, which dried into a mask and kept the insects away. Others would build small evening fires on a clay dish near the bow, and the smoke would drift over the deck, unpleasant to the nostrils, but unwelcome to the mosquitoes. The cleverest of all would simply wait, lying still beneath a length of linen, for the whining to stop, and it always did eventually. There is nothing so persistent, so patient, so determined as a mosquito, but even the mosquito must rest sometimes in the heavy, dark air of a flood season night. And so the boatman would lie, barely breathing, listening to the insect's departure. And then the silence would return, and the rocking, and the deep, grateful sigh of a man who knows that he has won a small victory, and that the rest of the night is his. Now consider the sounds of that night, the full orchestra of the flood. We have spoken of the frogs, but the frogs were only the beginning. There was the sound of the water itself, a low, continuous hush, like the breathing of a great sleeping animal. It was not a single sound. It was 1,000 sounds woven together. The small, lapping tongues of wavelets against the hull, the slow, deep gurgle of a current shifting, the occasional plop of a fish jumping, or a piece of mud falling from the bank. And there were the birds, though they were quieter at night. The heron would cry from somewhere far away, a rasping, lonely call that seemed to come from a great distance, and the boatman, without waking fully, would hear it and be comforted, because it meant that the world was still there, that the land was still there, that the flood had not erased everything. And sometimes, from the village, there would come the faint, rhythmic beat of a drum and voices singing, a festival marking some forgotten occasion. The boatmen, lying on their decks, would hear the music as if through a veil, muffled and dreamlike, and they would turn toward the village in their sleep, and their faces would soften, and they would dream of home. The boatmen were not always alone in their nightly rest. Some of them, as we have mentioned, were accompanied by their families, and the flood season was the time when families most often lived together on the water. There were many reasons for this. The fields were covered, the usual work was impossible, and the boat itself became the only dry place in a world of water. So the wife would come aboard, and the children, and the grandparents, if the boat was large enough. And the ordinary business of life would be carried out on the deck, in the open air, under the great wide sky. The mother would cook the evening meal over a small clay brazier, and the children would play among the nets and the coils of rope, and the grandfather would sit near the prow, watching the water with eyes that had seen it rise and fall for 60 years. And when the night came, they would find their places to sleep, not all together, but close, the children tucked into hollows and cubbyholes, the grandmother wrapped in a length of cloth near the center of the boat, the parents together at the stern. And there was a particular sound in these family boats that was different from the sound of a working crew. It was the sound of breathing, small and large, in a gentle, overlapping rhythm. The mother listening for her children, the children listening in their dreams for the voice of their mother, the grandfather waking briefly, hearing all of them and smiling in the dark before he closed his eyes again. The boat, carrying them all, was like a mother herself, holding them safely above the mysterious, generous, forgetful water that surrounded them. And there were the very young among them, babies born in the flood season, in the time of high water, learned to sleep to the rocking of the boat before they learned to walk. Their mothers wrapped them tightly in swaddling cloths, a practice that kept them warm and secure, and laid them in shallow baskets or in the curved hollow of a hull that had been lined with straw and reed matting. And the babies slept the deep, untroubled sleep of the very young, their faces slack, their small hands curled into fists, their lips moving occasionally in dreams of nothing at all. The boatmen would often pause in their work to look at these sleeping children, to marvel at the calmness of them. A man who had survived storms and rapids, who had hauled freight through the treacherous channels of the delta, who had seen the river take his friends and his cargo, would stand over a sleeping baby and feel his heart go soft. And he would wonder, perhaps, what kind of world the child would inherit, what the river would be like when the child grew to be an old man. And then he would return to his work, and the baby would continue to sleep, carried by the same water that had carried the baby's father and the father's father back into the depths of time. The stars, too, played their part in these flood season nights. Above the boatmen, in the great long night, the stars turned slowly and without hurry. The boatmen knew them by sight, not by name, or by a handful of names that were simple and useful. They watched the stars the way a farmer watches the sky, for signs and portents, for a sense of the hour, for the slow procession of the seasons. When the night was clear, the river glittered with reflected light, a million small glints dancing on the surface, and the boatman, opening his eyes for a moment, might have seen a pattern, a great river of stars bending overhead, and understood, without words, that his little boat was sailing through the midst of it. The stars were not distant and cold. They were near and bright, like familiar faces looking down with a quiet affection. And the boatman would feel himself to be a small thing, yes, but not an unimportant thing. He was a part of the great water, and the great water was a part of the great sky, and both of them were part of something even larger, something that held the whole world in its patient, dark hands. And with this thought, the boatman would sink again into sleep, and the stars would continue to turn, and the river would continue to flow, and the night would hold them all. Let us also think about the sleep of the boatmen as a shared experience, a communal weaving of rest. In the space of a single boat, there might be 3, 4, sometimes half a dozen men, and they slept close, bodies touching, sharing their warmth. On a cool night, this closeness was a comfort. They would lie side by side, or back to back, or curled in the familiar spoon of old friends, and they would take warmth from each other as the fire takes warmth from the wood. There was no shame in this, no awkwardness. It was simply the practical way of sleeping on a small boat, and it had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. The men knew each other's habits. They knew who snored and who the sleepwalker was, though sleepwalking on a boat was a dangerous thing and seldom happened. They knew who talked in his sleep, mumbling fragments of words that made no sense. They knew who had the nightmares and who slept like a stone. And they made allowances for each other, the way families do. The snorer was given a place at the edge, where his noise would be carried away by the wind. The one who talked was nudged gently when he became too loud. And the one who had the nightmares was never left to sleep alone. Someone would always lie near him, so that when he woke with a gasp, there was a hand to touch his shoulder, a voice to say, "It is nothing. The water is calm. You are safe." In the middle of the night, there would come a time when one of the men would rise. It was an ordinary thing, a natural thing. He would sit up, rubbing his eyes, and he would look around at the sleeping forms, and he would feel a tenderness for them, his crewmates, his brothers of the river. He would move carefully, stepping over outstretched legs and curled bodies, making his way to the edge of the boat. And there he would stand alone, looking out at the water. The moon would be up or not, and the water would be dark or silvered with light. And the man would take a long, slow breath, the air cool and damp, and full of the smell of wet earth and green growing things. He would listen to the sounds, the water, the frogs, the distant cry of a bird. And he would think, perhaps, of nothing at all, or of small things, of the tasks of the morning, of the price he would get for his cargo, of the face of his wife, which he could see more clearly than the water before him. And then he would return to his place and lie down, and the warmth of his sleeping companions would wrap around him, and he would be gone again, back into the dream, until the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky. Perhaps Seneb, too, had such a night. Let us imagine that, on the boat moored near the village, he woke in the deepest, darkest hour, though not because of a dream. Something had changed. The boat had shifted, maybe, or a rope had creaked. He lay still, his eyes open in the darkness, and he listened. The boy was still asleep in the bow, breathing softly. The frogs had quieted. The stars had turned. And Seneb felt a strange alertness, a clarity that sometimes comes in the middle of the night when the body is at rest and the mind is quiet. He thought of his wife and his children and the house where they slept. He thought of the fields under the flood, the grain that would be planted when the water went down. He thought of his boat, its honest wood, its familiar smell, the way it carried him year after year. And he felt, welling up in his chest, a simple and profound gratitude. He was not a rich man. He did not own a house or a field or a herd of cattle. He owned a boat and a rope and a set of oars and his own 2 hands. And yet, lying there on that small wooden deck, floating on the vast, dark water, he felt like the richest man in the world. The feeling was not something he could explain. It was a warmth, a fullness, a sense of being exactly where he was meant to be. And he closed his eyes, and he smiled in the dark, and he waited without impatience for the morning to come. There is a kind of sleep that the boatmen knew that we might call trust. It is not the sleep of the innocent, for they were not innocent. They had seen things. They knew that the river could be dangerous, that the flood could take a life as easily as it could give one. They knew that the world was not always kind. And yet, they slept. They lay down, night after night, upon the water, and they gave themselves to sleep. They did not lie awake, plotting and planning. They did not worry about the future beyond the next reach of the river. They did not carry their burdens, their anxieties, their regrets onto the deck with them. They had a way of setting them aside, like a heavy cloak, and when they lay down empty-handed. And in that emptiness, there was room for sleep to fill them. This is a mysterious thing, and perhaps it is not something we can learn, not exactly, but we can approach it. We can feel the shape of it, the possibility of it, as a boatman might feel the shape of a current in the dark. We can imagine what it would be like, just for a moment, to put down our own heavy cloaks and to lie down and to trust that we will be held. And as we reach the end of this long night, we find ourselves returning softly to where we began, to Seneb's little boat, moored near the village, with the boy asleep in the bow and Seneb asleep in the stern. The flood is still here. The water is still dark and smooth. The stars are turning overhead, and the frogs have begun to sing again, as if the night has taken a deep breath and is letting it out slowly. And Seneb is still sleeping, but his dreams have shifted. He is no longer sailing across a plain of water. He is no longer moving. He is standing on the land, in a field of green wheat, and the sun is warm on his back, and his wife is calling him from the house, and he is laughing. And even though he is asleep, he knows that he is dreaming, and so he holds on to the dream, keeping it close, letting it warm him from the inside. And then the dream fades, as all dreams fade, and he sinks into a deeper, darker, dreamless water, the sleep at the bottom of the night, where there is nothing at all, and there is no one to miss him. And we too are being carried, even now. Our own beds are our boats, and the night is our river, and we are floating slowly, gently, toward the dawn. We can let go. We can unclench our hands and soften our eyes and loosen the thoughts that have been holding us up. We can breathe, and as we breathe, we can feel the same deep rhythm that carries the water, that carries the earth, that carries the sleeping boatmen of the Nile. We are not alone. We are held. The night is a flood, and we are on the water, and the water has known us from the beginning, and it is not going to let us go. So let us drift. Let us sink, just a little, into the warm, dark depth, and let us sleep, the way Seneb slept, the way the river sleeps, the way the flood sleeps, in its long, slow breath between one season and the next. Good night, traveler. Good night, boatman. Good night, river. The stars are watching, and the boat is safe, and there is nothing left to do but rest and be carried and wait for the light. And yet, as the night stretches on and the stars turn their slow, indifferent wheels, there is one more thing we might whisper, one more small thought to carry with us as we fade. It is this: the boatmen of the Nile, in their simple, sturdy ways, were not very different from us. They loved, and they worried, and they worked, and they rested. They felt the cold and the heat. They laughed at jokes and wept at sorrows. They grew old and they died, and the river carried them in the end, as it had carried them all their lives. And their sleep, that nightly surrender, that small death, was their way of meeting the river on its own terms. They did not fight the current. They did not resist the dark. They yielded, and in yielding, they were kept safe. And so, if you find yourself in the middle of some night, unable to sleep, perhaps you might think of them. You might picture a small wooden boat and the dark water all around, and a man sleeping on the deck, his face turned to the stars. And you might imagine that you are with him, that you are lying on the deck beside him, and the boat is rocking gently, and the water is holding you up. And the whole world, the whole vast, complicated world, becomes a simple thing. A boat, a river, a sleeper, a star. And the sleep comes then like a tide, rising slowly, covering everything, until there is nothing left but the sound of water and the warmth of a blanket, and the peace that passes all understanding. Sleep well in that peace. Sleep well with the boatman. Sleep well with the river. And when you wake in the morning light, you will be new again, as the world is new, as the flood is new, each turning of the great and ancient year. Good night, then, truly. Good night.